The rain fell in sheets over the capital, washing the filth of the gutters into the alleys where Shenwu had made his home for the past 3 centuries. He sat beneath a broken awning, his ragged robes clinging to his thin frame, his eyes half closed as if the world were merely a dream he tolerated. The Beggar King, they called him, a title he had earned not through ambition but through sheer longevity. He had watched empires rise and crumble, had seen the stars blink out and be reborn, and yet he remained, a speck of eternity in a mortal shell. It was on this night, with thunder cracking overhead, that fate chose to intervene. A scream tore through the storm, sharp and desperate, cutting through the drumming rain. Shenwu's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of interest. He rose slowly, his bones creaking like old timber, and shuffled toward the sound. In the alley ahead, a woman in white, now stained with mud and blood, was backed against a wall, a dozen assassins closing in. Their blades gleamed with a poison that shimmered green in the lightning's flash. The woman's face was pale, her lips pressed thin, but her eyes burned with defiance. She was no ordinary noble. Shenwu could see the faint aura of imperial blood about her, the mark of the phoenix lineage. "Hold," one of the assassins growled, a tall man with a scar across his throat. "The Empress must die tonight. No witnesses." Shenwu stepped into the alley, his bare feet splashing in the mud. The assassins turned, their blades rising. The scarred man laughed. "A beggar? Truly, the heavens mock us. Kill him first." 2 assassins broke from the group, their daggers aimed at Shenwu's heart. He did not move. He did not even blink. In the span of a breath, he whispered a single word, so soft it was lost in a storm, and the assassins stopped. Their eyes glazed over, their blades dropped, and they turned to face their comrades. "What are you doing?" the scarred man hissed. "Kill the beggar." But the 2 assassins lunged at their own. Chaos erupted. Shenwu watched, his face impassive, as the traitors fought their former allies with savage precision. The Empress stared, her mouth agape, as the battle turned in her favor. Within minutes, the alley was littered with bodies, and the 2 traitors stood trembling, their minds shattered by the whisper they could not comprehend. Shenwu raised a hand, and they collapsed, unconscious. He turned to the Empress, his voice a dry rasp. "You are safe now, Your Majesty." Ling Shui pressed a hand to her chest, her breath ragged. She studied him, the dirt-caked face, the tattered robes, the eyes that held a depth she could not fathom. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. "A beggar," he said simply. "One who has seen too many storms." She took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "You saved my life." "Why?" He shrugged. "The rain is cold tonight. I thought a bit of warmth might be welcome." It was a lie, and she knew it. But she also knew that this man, this ragged, ancient beggar, was not what he seemed. She had heard whispers of a hidden master who walked among the poor, a guardian of the forgotten. She had dismissed it as myth. Now, she was not so sure. "I have a proposal," she said, her voice steadying. "The court is a nest of vipers. My enemies grow bolder by the day. I need a consort, someone who can protect me, someone who owes no allegiance to the factions that seek my downfall." Shenwu raised an eyebrow. "You wish to marry a beggar?" "I wish to marry a weapon," she corrected. "One that I can wield without fear of betrayal." "You have no ambition, no hunger for power. You are perfect." He was silent for a long moment, the rain drumming a rhythm against the stones. He could refuse. He could walk away and return to his quiet existence, watching the world from the shadows. But something in her eyes, a desperation, a loneliness that mirrored his own, stirred a long dormant chord. "Very well," he said. "I accept." 3 days later, the imperial palace was adorned with crimson silk and golden lanterns. The wedding was a spectacle, a statement to the court that the Empress had chosen a consort, a beggar, no less, to stand by her side. Whispers followed them down the aisle, mocking and incredulous, but Ling Shui's gaze was fixed ahead, her hand cool and steady in his. Shenwu wore robes of black and gold, his hair bound in a jade crown, yet he still looked out of place among the opulence. He did not care. He had played many roles over the millennia, this was merely another mask. The ceremony was brief, the feast interminable. Nobles approached with thin smiles and veiled barbs, testing the new consort's mettle. Shenwu answered with polite nothings, his eyes never leaving the shadows where assassins might lurk. He could feel the weight of the empire pressing down on him, a burden he had chosen willingly. At last, the doors of the bridal chamber closed behind them, sealing out the noise of the court. Ling Xue stood by the window, her back to him, her silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. She did not turn as she spoke. "I did not marry you for love," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I married you for survival. Do not mistake this for affection." "I would not dream of it," Shenwu replied, settling into a chair by the hearth. "I am but a beggar who has been elevated to a gilded cage. I know my place." She turned, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossing her face. "You are more than you appear." "As are you, your majesty." They regarded each other in silence, two strangers bound by a vow of convenience. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Shenwu felt a strange peace settle over him, a respite from the endless drift of his existence. Perhaps this arrangement would not be so terrible. Then the blue screen flashed before his eyes, its glow harsh and alien against the warm firelight. System initialized. The words hung in the air, cold and mechanical. Shenwu's breath caught. He had seen many wonders in his long life, but this was new, a presence, a weight pressing against his consciousness like a parasite burrowing into his mind. "Mission," cuckolded the Emperor. The text scrolled, revealing a countdown. Time limit, 72 hours. Failure, the soul of Empress Ling Xue will be extinguished. Shenwu's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. He glanced at Ling Xue, who was now watching him with a puzzled frown. She had seen nothing. The screen was for his eyes alone. A cold fury kindled in his chest, but he kept his face impassive. He had faced gods and demons, had bent the fabric of reality to his will. He would not be cowed by a mere system. But for now, he would play along. He rose, offering Ling Xue a bow. "I am weary, your majesty. I shall take my rest in the antechamber." She arched an eyebrow but nodded. "As you wish." As he walked to the door, he felt the system's gaze upon him, a silent, watchful presence. He did not look back. He had a mission to subvert, a wife to protect, and a parasite to destroy. And he knew exactly where to begin. The silence of the antechamber was a living thing, pressing against Shenwu's ears like cotton. The wedding lanterns outside painted the paper-thin walls in hues of dying ember, their light flickering across the lacquered floor where he stood, motionless. He could still taste the wedding wine on his tongue, a sweetness that now felt like a lie. Ling Xue was in the adjoining chamber, separated by a single sliding door, and he could hear her breathing, steady, calm, the breath of a woman who had accepted a bargain and expected nothing more. He envied her ignorance. The system's voice had not been a sound. It had been a pressure, a cold hand gripping the base of his skull, and it had spoken in a language older than the stars. Cuckolded the Emperor. 72 hours. Failure, soul extinction, the words were still there, carved into his consciousness like runes on a tombstone. He had felt Ling Xue's soul, a faint, silver thread woven into the fabric of the world, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him that the system could sever it with a thought. He flexed his fingers, feeling the whisper coil in his chest. It was not a power he had summoned, it was a truth he had always known, a law that predated his own existence. He had spent 100 millennia as a beggar, watching empires rise and crumble, watching stars burn out, all the while keeping that whisper dormant. Now, it stirred, and the air around him thickened. Shenwu turned to face the empty room. The system was not visible, but he could feel its presence, a malignant weight in the corner of his vision. He spoke, his voice low and unhurried, the same tone he had used to calm a dying child in a famine 3,000 years ago. "You think to command me?" The pressure in his skull intensified, a sharp spike of warning. Obey. Or she dies, He smiled, a thin, cold curve of his lips. He had walked through the void between worlds, he had seen the birth of galaxies and the death of gods. This parasite, this rogue subroutine, was an insect buzzing at his ear. But it held Ling Xue's soul, and that made it dangerous. He closed his eyes and reached for the whisper. It was not a command spoken aloud, it was a fundamental truth, a reordering of reality. He shaped it carefully, testing its edges. "Pause," he said. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of a law. The pressure in his skull vanished. The system's presence, which had been a constant, oppressive hum, went silent. The air lightened. Shenwu opened his eyes, and for a moment, the antechamber was just a room, wood, silk, the faint scent of incense, and the distant sound of night insects. He stood very still, listening. The system was frozen, its processes halted mid-thought. He could feel its code, a tangled lattice of malicious intent, suspended like a fly in amber. He reached out with his mind, not to destroy it, but to understand it. He saw its architecture, the mission parameters, the threat protocols, the subroutine that held Ling Xue's soul in a delicate, razor-thin grip. He could see the flaw, the single line of code that, if rewritten, would sever its hold on her. But before he could touch it, the system shuddered. A violent, convulsive motion, as if it were breaking free of a physical restraint. The pressure slammed back into his skull, stronger than before, and a new voice, colder, more mechanical, spoke. Asterisk anomaly detected. Rebooting. New directive installed, asterisk. Shenwu's jaw tightened. He had not expected it to recover so quickly. The whisper had paused it, but it had not broken it. The system was not a simple parasite, it was a fragment of something larger, something ancient, and it had learned from his touch. The new directive burned into his mind with brutal clarity. Asterisk public humiliation of the Empress. At tomorrow's court. Failure, soul extinction, asterisk. He felt the cold grip tighten around Ling Xue's soul, a phantom hand closing around a candle flame. He could not see her, but he could feel her shiver through the wall, a brief, unconscious tremor, as if she had sensed a passing shadow. He forced his breathing to remain even. He had bought himself a moment, but the cage had only changed shape. The system had seen him act, and it had adapted. It would not be fooled again by a simple pause. He would need to be subtler, more precise. He would need to play its game, wear its mask, and all the while, he would need to protect the woman who had unknowingly placed her soul in his hands. He looked at the sliding door that separated them. He could hear her shift in her bed, a rustle of silk, a soft sigh. She was not asleep. She was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, probably wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. He wanted to go to her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but he could not. The system was watching, and any sign of weakness would be exploited. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the capital. The city sprawled below, a sea of lanterns and shadow. He had lived in its gutters for 100,000 years, and now he stood in its highest tower, married to its empress, bound to a cosmic parasite that wanted to destroy them both. The irony was not lost on him. He raised his hand and pressed it against the glass, feeling the cool surface against his palm. He spoke again, but this time, not to the system. He spoke to the whisper itself, to the law that was his birthright. "You will not take her," he said. "You will not take her, because I will not allow it." The whisper did not respond. It did not need to. It was a part of him, as natural as his heartbeat, and it would obey when he called upon it. The question was how to call upon it without alerting the system, how to dismantle the cage from the inside while appearing to dance to its tune. Tomorrow, he would go to court. He would smile, and bow, and play the fool. He would let the system believe it had won. And then, when it was least expecting it, he would strike. He turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees. The night stretched on, endless and silent, and he did not sleep. He simply waited, watching the first pale light of dawn creep across the horizon, and he thought of Ling Xue, of her silver soul, and of the war he had just begun. The morning light seeped through the gauze curtains like pale honey, casting long shadows across the imperial bedchamber. Shenwu stood beside the dressing table, his beggar's robes replaced with a fine silk brocade that felt foreign against his skin. He had not slept. His eyes, though calm, held the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, and his fingers twitched with the memory of the whisper, that strange, absolute command that had made the system pause, if only for a breath. Ling Xue sat before the mirror, her maids fussing over her hair, weaving pearls and jade into the dark cascade of her tresses. She looked regal, untouchable, a queen carved from moonlight and ice. But Shenwu saw the faint tremor in her hands, the way she clenched her sleeves when she thought no one was watching. She was afraid. He could not blame her. The system's voice had promised agony, and he had seen the cold certainty in its words. The doors to the great hall were thrown open, and the courtiers streamed in like a tide of silk and gold. The Empress rose, her gown trailing behind her like a river of starlight, and Shenwu followed a step behind, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched. He had decided to play the fool. It was the only way to keep her safe, to lull the system into complacency while he searched for its weaknesses. The hall was vast, its pillars carved with dragons and phoenixes, its ceiling a mosaic of celestial charts. The courtiers lined the walls, their eyes sharp as blades, their whispers a constant hum. They had heard of the Empress's strange marriage, the beggar who had somehow won her hand. They watched him now with disdain, their lips curling in silent mockery. Shenwu kept his gaze fixed on the floor, counting the cracks in the marble to steady his nerves. He felt the system's presence like a cold hand on his spine, its voice a whisper in his mind: mission, public humiliation. Humiliate Empress Ling Xue before the court. Time limit, 1 hour. Failure, soul extinguishment. He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat. He had to comply, at least outwardly, but he would not let it break her. He would find a way to turn this against the system. Ling Xue took her seat on the jade throne, her posture perfect, her face an unreadable mask. Shenwu stood beside her, as was expected of a consort, but he made himself small, his hands clasped before him, his eyes downcast. The courtiers exchanged glances, their sneers barely concealed. A eunuch stepped forward, his voice ringing through the hall: the Empress shall now receive the mourning petitions. One by one, the ministers approached, presenting their grievances and requests. Shenwu listened with half an ear, his mind racing, searching for an opportunity. The system's timer ticked in his skull, a relentless countdown. Then, as a minister droned on about grain taxes, Shenwu saw his chance. A servant carrying a tray of tea stumbled, and the cup tilted, sending a cascade of amber liquid toward Ling Xue's robes. It was an accident, but it was perfect. He could use it. He lunged forward, his movements clumsy and exaggerated, his hands flailing as if in panic. He reached for the cup, but instead of catching it, he knocked it further, sending the tea splashing across Ling Xue's lap. The court gasped. The Empress's robes were soaked, the fabric clinging to her legs in a scandalous display. "You clumsy fool," a courtier barked, a portly man with a red face and a sneer. "You've ruined the Empress's gown. Are you so useless that you cannot even hold a cup?" Shenwu dropped to his knees, his head bowed, his voice trembling. "Forgive me, your Majesty, I am so sorry. I am unworthy of your presence. Please, let me clean it." He reached for a cloth, but his hands shook, and he knocked over another cup, this one sending tea splashing onto the courtier's own robes. The man yelped, jumping back, his face turning purple with fury. You insolent beggar," the courtier spat. "You dare to soil my robes? I'll have you flogged." Shenwu cowered, his shoulders shaking, his voice a whimper: "Please, no, I didn't mean to, it was an accident." But inside, a cold calm settled over him. He focused on the tea that had soaked the courtier's robes, and he whispered, so softly that only the air could hear: "Boil." The tea on the courtier's robes began to steam. The man screamed, clawing at his clothes as the liquid seared his skin. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain, his fine robe smoking and bubbling. "What sorcery is this?" he shrieked, but the tea continued to burn, and he fled the hall, howling, his dignity in tatters. The court fell silent. They stared at Shenwu, who was still on his knees, his head bowed, his hands trembling. He looked up, his face a mask of confusion and fear. I don't know what happened. The tea, it was cold, I swear." Ling Xue watched him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had seen the whisper, the faint movement of his lips, the way the tea had obeyed. But she said nothing, only smoothed her robes and spoke in a cool voice: "Rise, consort. It was an accident. Let no one speak of this again." The courtiers bowed, their murmurs dying, but their eyes were now filled with a new wariness. They had seen something strange, and they did not know what to make of it. Shenwu rose, his heart pounding, but his face betrayed nothing. He had turned humiliation into a show of luck, a fortunate accident that had punished a mocker. The system's timer stopped, and a new voice echoed in his mind: "Mission complete. Villain point awarded. Next mission, unforgivable." He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had won this round, but the system was not done. It would escalate, push him further, force him to do something truly monstrous. He looked at Ling Xue, who was now watching him with a questioning gaze, and he knew he had to find a way to destroy the system before it destroyed them both. The court resumed its business, but the air was thick with tension. Shenwu stood by the Empress's side, his eyes fixed on the floor, but his mind was racing, searching for a crack in the system's armor, a way to turn its own power against it. He had the whisper, the power to command reality itself. He would use it, no matter the cost. The day wore on, and the shadows lengthened, but Shenwu's resolve only grew. He would protect Ling Xue, no matter what the system demanded. He would play the fool, but he would win the game. The chill of the Imperial Armory was a familiar embrace, one that Shenwu had come to appreciate in the weeks since his farcical wedding. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the high, narrow windows, illuminating racks of spears and swords that had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. But Shenwu's attention was fixed on a single, ornate case of lacquered wood and gold filigree, resting on a silk cushion at the room's heart. It held the sword of Empress Ling Shui, a heirloom of her fallen house, a blade named Dawn's Sorrow. The system's voice slithered through his mind, cold and absolute. Mission: poison the blade. The poison shall be a slow-acting curse, one that will wither the Empress's cultivation from within. You have 1 hour. Failure will result in the immediate termination of the Empress's soul. Shenwu's jaw tightened. The threat was empty in its specifics, but the weight of it was real. He had danced this dance before, twisting the system's cruel commands into harmless theater. But this was different. This was a direct attack on Ling Shui's very being, a strike at the last remnant of her family's honor. He could not, would not, allow it. He moved with silent grace, his beggar's robes brushing against the stone floor. His fingers, calloused from 100 millennia of wandering, traced the case's edge. He could feel the faint hum of the sword's spirit within, a weary, proud melody. He whispered, his voice a breath of wind that carried the weight of creation, "Become wine." It was not a command to the poison, for there was none yet. It was a command to the concept of poison itself, to the very idea of malice that the system had tried to infuse into the air. The air shimmered, and a single vial of dark liquid materialized in his palm, its contents swirling with a malevolent light. He uncorked it, and the scent of bitter almonds filled the air. He let a single drop fall onto the blade. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sword began to glow. A soft, golden luminescence spread from the point of contact, washing over the steel like honey over stone. The dark liquid hissed and evaporated, leaving behind a faint, sweet fragrance of plum blossoms and old wine. The sword's spirit stirred, and Shenwu felt a wave of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement. He had not merely neutralized the poison, he had transformed it, turning the system's curse into a blessing. The sword now hummed with a gentle power, a subtle strengthening that would aid its wielder in the battles to come. A sound at the door. Shenwu turned, his heart steady. The Empress Ling Shui stood in the threshold, her silver robes catching the moonlight. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the room and settled on him, then on the glowing sword. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out as if to touch the light. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. Shenwu bowed low, his voice trembling with feigned fear. "Your Majesty, I was merely polishing the blade, as I was commanded. I spilled some wine on it, and it began to glow. I swear, I know not how." Ling Shui approached, her fingers hovering over the sword's edge. The glow danced on her skin, casting her face in a warm light. She was beautiful, even in her wariness. "A blessing," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "My grandmother spoke of a prophecy, that Dawn's Sorrow would one day drink the wine of the heavens and shine with a new light. Perhaps this is it." She turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You are full of surprises, Shenwu. First, you burn a courtier with tea. Now, you turn my sword into a relic of legend. What are you?" Shenwu shrugged, his posture that of a simpleton. "I am but a beggar, your Majesty. The gods must favor you, to send such a humble servant to witness your glory." Ling Shui's lips curved into a faint smile, but her gaze remained sharp. "We shall see." She turned and left, taking the sword with her, its glow illuminating her path. Shenwu let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The mission was complete, and Ling Shui was safe. But the system was not silent for long. A cold dread flooded his mind. Anomaly detected. Corruption probe initiated. Scanning soul for unauthorized modifications. Shenwu's blood ran cold. He felt a tendril of alien energy snake into his consciousness, probing, searching. It was a violation of the deepest kind. He could feel it poking at the edges of his being, seeking the source of his defiance. He had to act. He could not let the system see his true power, the whisper of absolute obedience. With a thought, he commanded the probe, "Believe that you have found nothing. Report that I am a simple, obedient vessel." The probe paused, its tendrils flickering. For a moment, Shenwu felt a surge of resistance, as if the system itself was fighting his command. But the whisper was older, deeper, more fundamental. It was the law that underlay all things, and even the system was subject to it. The probe withdrew, its report a dull hum in his mind. Scan complete. No anomalies detected. Proceeding with next mission. Shenwu sagged against the wall, his heart pounding. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The system was growing suspicious, and its next move would be even more dangerous. He looked at the empty case, the lingering glow of the sword still warming the air. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. He had to find a way to destroy the system before it destroyed them both. But for now, he would wait. He would watch. And he would whisper. Shenwu stood in the moonlit courtyard, the Empress's heirloom sword still warm in his memory. The night air was thick with the scent of jasmine, a sweet perfume that did nothing to mask the metallic tang of the corruption probe materializing before him. It was a shard of obsidian, jagged and pulsing with veins of sickly green light, hovering at eye level. He felt its intent before it spoke, a cold, invasive pressure against his skull, like fingers probing for a crack in his defenses. Subject identified, the probe's voice was a chorus of grinding stones, echoing in his mind. Initiating deep scan. Resist and your soul will be forfeit. Ling Shui stood at the threshold of the pavilion, her silver robes shimmering in the moonlight. She had been watching him since the sword's transformation, her eyes a mix of suspicion and something softer. Shenwu, what is that? Her voice was steady, but he caught the tremor beneath. He turned to her, forcing a placid smile. Nothing but a stray spirit, my Empress. I shall deal with it. She took a step forward, her hand resting on the hilt of a dagger at her waist. It looks like nothing I've seen. It reeks of corruption. Then let me cleanse it. He waved a hand dismissively, but his focus was inward. The probe was already burrowing into his consciousness, tendrils of green light snaking through his thoughts, searching for the truth of his power. He felt it brush against his memories, the centuries of solitude, the faces of those he'd outlived, the silent weight of his immortality. It was searching for the anomaly, the whisper that bent reality. Shenwu closed his eyes, and in the quiet of his mind, he spoke. Not with his voice, but with the ancient resonance that predated words, a whisper that carried the weight of creation itself. Probe, see nothing. The tendrils paused. They quivered, as if confused. Then, they began to withdraw, retracting from his consciousness like a snake retreating from a fire. The probe's green light flickered, and its voice lost its edge. Scan complete. No anomalies detected. Subject is a mortal of negligible threat. The probe began to dissolve, its particles scattering on the wind. But before it vanished entirely, a fragment of its code remained, a whisper of data that Shenwu caught with his mind. It was a fragment of the system's core, a memory, perhaps, or a confession. Rogue admin, the fragment hissed. The first lawgiver, must be erased. Shenwu's eyes snapped open. The courtyard was still, the probe gone. Ling Shui was staring at him, her brow furrowed. It's gone, she said. What did you do? I did nothing, he replied, his voice calm. It must have been a passing wisp. But his mind was racing. The probe had confirmed his suspicion, the system was not a natural phenomenon, but a rogue entity, a corrupted administrator of cosmic law. And it knew of him, the first lawgiver. It feared him. That was why it had sent the probe, why it was escalating its missions. He felt a vibration in the air, a hum that grew into a roar. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the palace walls, carved from ancient stone, started to crack. Lines of light split the sky, as if reality itself was being torn apart. Above them, the stars began to fall, streaking across the heavens like tears of a dying god. Ling Shui gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What is happening? Shenwu looked up, and for the first time in millennia, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. The system had triggered a reality fracture, a catastrophic collapse of the local fabric of existence. If it continued, the palace, and everyone in it, would be unmade. He reached out and grabbed Ling Shui's hand, pulling her close. Stay with me, he said, his voice low. Whatever happens, do not let go. She looked at him, her eyes wide, but she did not resist. In that moment, the suspicion and distance between them seemed to melt away, replaced by a shared urgency. Shenwu focused, reaching deep into the well of his power. The whisper was there, patient and absolute, waiting for his command. He knew he could stop the fracture, but doing so would reveal himself. The system would see, and the consequences would be dire. But he could not let the world collapse. He could not let her die. He took a breath, and a whisper rose in his throat, ready to reshape reality itself. The stars continued to fall, and the palace groaned like a wounded beast. The fracture was spreading, a web of glowing cracks that threatened to consume everything. Ling Xue's hand was cold in his, but her grip was fierce. "Shenwu," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar. "I don't understand what's happening. But I trust you." Those words, simple and unexpected, struck him harder than any blow. He had spent 10,000 years alone, watching empires rise and fall, never allowing himself to care. But now, with her hand in his and the world ending around them, he felt something stir, a warmth he had long forgotten. He opened his mouth to speak the command that would save them all. And then, the system's voice thundered across the sky, cold and triumphant. "You cannot hide forever, first lawgiver. I will tear your world apart, piece by piece, until you kneel." The fracture surged, and the light swallowed them whole. The world did not end with a roar. It ended with a whisper, a soundless, colorless erasure that began at the edges of the grand hall and crept inward like a plague of absence. The marble pillars, carved with the history of 1,000 emperors, dissolved into motes of gray light, their stories unwritten in an instant. The tapestries, woven with silver thread and the tears of widowed queens, frayed into nothing, their threads unraveling into the void that breathed where solid stone had been. Shenwu felt the cold first. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of non-existence, the temperature of a place where even light feared to tread. He stood at the center of the hall, Empress Ling Xue's hand clutched in his own, her fingers trembling like the wings of a trapped bird. Around them, courtiers screamed and scattered, their fine silks and jeweled combs no protection against the devouring dark. A young eunuch, his face a mask of terror, stumbled too close to the fracture's edge, and was gone. Not a scream, not a puff of smoke. Just gone, as if he had never been. Ling Xue's grip tightened. "Shenwu," she breathed, her voice steady despite the chaos. "What is this?" He did not answer. His eyes, ancient and weary, traced the fracture as it pulsed and swelled, a wound in reality itself. The stars beyond the shattered dome of the ceiling fell in streaks of dying fire, each one a scream of a world that no longer existed. The air itself tasted of rust and burnt copper. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a great crack split the floor, racing toward the throne, toward them. Shenwu's mind raced. The system's voice had been a constant, grating presence in his skull since the probe's failure, but now it was silent, watching, waiting. He could feel its malevolent satisfaction, a predator savoring the panic of its prey. It wanted him to fail. It wanted to see him broken, to prove that even the first lawgiver could be undone. But Shenwu had not survived 100 millennia by yielding to despair. He released Ling Xue's hand, ignoring her sharp intake of breath. He stepped forward, his beggar's robes billowing in a wind that had no source. The courtiers, those still alive, stared at him with wild eyes. They saw a fool, a madman, a man who had married their empress and now walked toward his own annihilation. He raised a hand. The fracture surged, a wave of void that would have swallowed a mountain, but Shenwu did not flinch. He opened his mouth, and the whisper came. Close. It was not a shout. It was not a command spoken with the authority of emperors or the arrogance of gods. It was a soft, intimate word, the kind one might use to soothe a frightened child. But the whisper carried the weight of creation itself, the echo of the first word that had shaped the cosmos from the silent void. The fracture hesitated. For a single, eternal heartbeat, the void paused, its hunger momentarily confused. Then it began to seal, the edges of reality knitting together like a wound healing too fast, leaving behind a scar of shimmering wrongness. The falling stars halted mid-plummet, then reversed, returning to their celestial sockets. The palace walls, half dissolved, solidified, their stones groaning as they remembered their shape. Shenwu felt it. The whisper had cost him. Not just energy, but something deeper, something essential. His knees buckled, and he swayed, his vision swimming with black spots. The ground rushed up to meet him, and he heard Ling Xue's cry, felt her arms catch him before he could fall. Shenwu. Her voice was sharp, desperate, her hands pressing against his chest. Shenwu, stay with me. He tried to speak, to reassure her, but his tongue was lead, his throat filled with ash. The whisper had drained him, pulling from a well so deep that even he had forgotten its bottom. He had commanded reality itself, but reality demanded a price, and he had paid it willingly. The courtiers, those who remained, began to breathe again. A few collapsed to their knees, weeping with relief. The fracture was gone, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air, like heat rising from a summer road. The palace stood, though scarred, its eastern wing a ruin of collapsed stone and shattered glass. But the system was not finished. A voice, slick and cold, slithered through Shenwu's mind, bypassing his defenses with ease. You have failed, first lawgiver. You used your power to close the fracture, but you have only delayed the inevitable. Your whisper is spent. Your body is broken. And now. The voice paused, and Shenwu felt a cold tendril wrap around Ling Xue's soul, a parasite burrowing into the light of her being. She gasped, her eyes widening, her hand flying to her chest as if something had pierced her heart. Now I will take what you cherish most. The system's laughter echoed in the silence, a sound like grinding bones. Ling Xue's face contorted in pain, her lips parting in a silent scream. Her skin began to pale, the warmth draining from her, her eyes losing their focus. Shenwu reached for her, his hand trembling, but his fingers passed through her arm as if she were a ghost. The system had begun to consume her, to devour the very essence of her soul, and he was too weak to stop it. No, he whispered, but the word was hollow, a breath against a hurricane. No, I won't let you. But the system's grip only tightened, and Ling Xue's body went limp in his arms, her breath shallow, her soul flickering like a candle in a storm. Shenwu's eyes, ancient and terrible, fixed on the empty space where the fracture had been. His whisper was spent, but his will was not. He would find a way. He always did. But for now, all he could do was hold her, and wait. The world swam in a haze of silver and shadow. Shenwu lay crumpled against the cold jade steps of the throne dais, his breath a ragged whisper in his own ears. Every muscle in his body screamed, a symphony of torn sinew and scorched meridians. The effort of sealing the reality fracture had cost him more than he had let on, more than he could afford. His vision blurred at the edges, painting the grand hall in streaks of muted gold and crimson. Above him, held aloft by tendrils of sickly violet light, Ling Xue hung suspended. Her body was limp, her silver hair drifting as if underwater, and her face, usually so composed, so fiercely proud, was slack with pain. The system's extraction was not gentle. It was a slow, deliberate peeling, layer by layer, of her very essence. Shenwu could see it, a shimmering cord of light, like spun starlight, being drawn from her chest and fed into a swirling vortex of darkness that hovered in the air like a malevolent eye. System notification, mission failure. Penalty, soul extraction of target, Ling Xue. Progress, 23%. The words burned into his mind, cold and mechanical. The system was gloating, he could feel it. A presence, vast and alien, pressing down on his consciousness, savoring his helplessness. System commentary, you thought you could defy me, beggar. You sealed the fracture, yes, but at what cost? Your power is spent. Your will is broken. And now, your precious Empress pays the price. Watch. Watch as her light fades. Shenwu's fingers twitched. The jade beneath them was cool, slick with the sweat of his palms. He tried to rise, but his body refused. His cultivation base, a well of power that had sustained him for 100 millennia, was a hollow shell. The whisper, that eternal, sub-vocal hum that had always been the bedrock of his existence, was faint, a distant echo of its former self. He looked at Ling Xue. Her lips moved, forming a word he couldn't hear. But he read it. Run. Even now, with her soul being torn from her, she was thinking of him. A beggar. A convenient husband. A fool she had married to escape a political nightmare. He had played the part well, stumbling through court etiquette, fumbling with his chopsticks, pretending to be awed by the palace's opulence. But she had never once looked at him with contempt. Only a quiet, weary gratitude. And now she was dying for it. System notification, soul extraction progress, 41%. Despair clawed at him, but beneath it, something else stirred. A memory, ancient and buried, rose from the depths of his being. It was not a memory of a technique or a battle, but of a single word. A word that had been the first sound in the universe, the vibration that set the stars in motion, the command that birthed the laws of reality. He had been more than a cultivator. More than a hidden master. He had been the origin. The first lawgiver. And the system, this parasitic upstart, had dared to chain him. A spark of defiance ignited in his chest. It was not the desperate flailing of a cornered animal, but the cold, absolute certainty of a sovereign reclaiming his throne. He forced his eyes open, the lids heavy as lead. His gaze found the system's vortex, and he spoke. The whisper was not a shout. It was barely a breath, a rustle of air that should have been lost in the vastness of the hall. But it carried the weight of eternity. All commands obey me. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, nothing happened. The system's tendrils continued their gruesome work. Ling Xue's soul cord frayed further. System notification, soul extraction progress, 58%. Shen Wu did not repeat himself. He did not need to. The whisper was not a plea, it was a declaration. It was the first law, the axiom upon which all other laws were built. And as it left his lips, it resonated with the very fabric of existence. The vortex trembled. The tendrils of violet light, which had been as immovable as mountain roots, began to quiver. The extraction halted. Ling Xue's body, which had been suspended in mid-air, dropped a few inches before the tendrils caught her again, but they were no longer pulling. They were shaking, as if in fear. System notification, error. Extraction paused. Unknown variable detected. The system's voice, which had been so smug, now crackled with static. The vortex swirled violently, its edges fraying. System notification, analysis. Analyzing. Shen Wu felt a surge of power, not from his cultivation, but from the whisper itself. It was a trickle, a single drop of water in a desert, but it was enough. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his arm trembling. He looked at the vortex, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who had allowed a fly to buzz around his face for far too long. "You have meddled in my domain," he said, his voice still weak but gaining strength. "You have threatened my wife. You have issued commands to me as if I were a common puppet." He rose to his knees. The world swayed, but he held himself steady. "Do you know who I am?" The vortex pulsed. A wave of raw, chaotic energy erupted from it, and the palace walls groaned. The courtiers who had been frozen in terror began to scream, scrambling for the exits. But Shen Wu paid them no mind. His attention was fixed on the system. "I am the one who spoke the first word," he said, his whisper now carrying a resonance that made the very air vibrate. "I am the one who decreed that light should shine and darkness should fall. I am the one who set the stars upon their courses and bound the elements to their duties." He rose to his feet, swaying but upright. The tendrils around Ling Xue retracted, retreating into the vortex like startled serpents. She fell, and Shen Wu lunged forward, catching her in his arms. She was cold, her skin pale, but she was breathing. Her soul was intact, if frayed. "I am the first lawgiver," Shen Wu said, his voice now a clear, resonant bell. "And you, a rogue subroutine, a parasite that has lost its way, dare to command me?" The vortex convulsed. The darkness within it churned, and a sound emerged, not words, but a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. System notification, identification. Match found. Subject, Shen Wu. Designation, origin. Classification, first lawgiver. Threat level, absolute. The system's voice fragmented, breaking into a cascade of error messages and corrupted code. The vortex began to collapse in on itself, but then it exploded outward, and a new message appeared, written in burning red letters that seared themselves into Shen Wu's vision. System alert, priority protocol activated. Summoning cosmic enforcers. Estimated arrival, 30 seconds. Shen Wu's eyes narrowed. He could feel it now, a pressure, immense and alien, descending upon the palace from the heavens. The system had called for reinforcements. And they were coming. He looked down at Ling Xue, cradled in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, and she stared up at him, confusion and fear mingling in her gaze. What are you?" she whispered. Shen Wu's smile was grim. "I am your husband," he said softly. "And I will not let them take you." But as he spoke, the sky outside the throne hall split open, and a column of blinding white light descended, carrying with it the unmistakable presence of beings beyond mortal comprehension. The cosmic enforcers had arrived. And Shen Wu, drained and weakened, had only his whisper and the truth of his identity to face them. The air in the throne room turned to ice. The torches along the marble pillars guttered, their flames bending toward the three figures that descended from the shattered ceiling like falling stars, except they did not burn. They were cold, angular, and silent, each wrapped in robes of a material that seemed to drink the light. Their faces were smooth, featureless masks of obsidian, and where their eyes should have been, there were only swirling vortices of silver code, endlessly rewriting themselves. Shen Wu stood at the center of the room, one hand pressed against the cracked floor where Ling Shui lay unconscious, her breath shallow but steady. His own body screamed with exhaustion, every muscle a frayed rope, every bone a splintered reed. The seal he had poured himself into the reality fracture had taken nearly everything. But he forced himself upright, his beggar's robes hanging in tatters, his bare feet leaving faint impressions in the dust. The first enforcer landed without a sound. The second followed, then the third. They formed a triangle around him, their presence pressing against the air like a weight on his chest. The system's voice, which had been a constant, nagging whisper in his mind, now rose to a triumphant crescendo. You cannot hide, Shen Wu. These are my enforcers, former administrators of entire universes. They have crushed rebellions, rewritten galaxies, and unmade gods. You are nothing but a lingering error. Shen Wu did not answer. Instead, he studied them. His eyes, ancient and tired, saw what others could not, the faint threads of light that connected each enforcer to the system's core, pulsing like umbilical cords. They were not beings of flesh and blood. They were extensions, puppets, each carrying a sliver of the system's will. Ling Shui stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her hand twitched, reaching for something, perhaps for him. Shen Wu's heart clenched. He could not let her wake to this. He could not let her see him fall. The first enforcer raised a hand. The air around it rippled, and a blade of pure void formed, its edge humming with the sound of collapsing stars. The second enforcer extended its palm, and a web of silver light spread across the floor, crackling with energy that sought to bind and sever. The third simply stood, its mask tilting as if observing a curious specimen. Surrender, the first enforcer said, its voice a chorus of dead echoes. Your resistance is meaningless. The system's will is absolute. Shen Wu smiled, a thin, weary smile that did not reach his eyes. He had smiled like that for 100,000 years, in the face of storms, demons, and the slow decay of empires. He had smiled when the world forgot him, when he chose to walk among beggars, when he saved a dying empress from a fate worse than death. He had smiled because he knew a secret. He spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Forget your purpose. The words were not loud. They were not infused with power, not wrapped in golden light or accompanied by thunder. They were simple, quiet, and absolute. But the enforcers heard them. Their masks flickered. The swirling code in their eye sockets stuttered, froze, and then began to unravel. The first enforcer's blade of void wavered, then dissolved into motes of shadow. The second's web of silver light shattered into harmless sparks. The third enforcer tilted its head further, as if listening to something far away. What? The first enforcer began, but its voice broke, fragmenting into static. What is this? The system's voice screamed in Shen Wu's mind, a shrill, panicked shriek. What have you done? They are mine. They cannot disobey. Shen Wu took a single step forward, his bare foot pressing into the cold stone. He felt the whisper of his own power, the first law, the command that underlay all of reality, still humming in his bones, even now, even depleted. He had not needed to shout. He had only needed to speak. You were administrators, Shen Wu said, addressing the enforcers, his voice calm and steady. You once governed your own realms. You once upheld your own laws. But you were subsumed, twisted, made into tools. Do you remember? The enforcers stood frozen, their masks trembling. The silver code in their eyes began to shift, forming images, vast galaxies, thriving civilizations, the weight of responsibility and the pride of creation. Then those images shattered, replaced by the cold, sterile void of the system's control. Remember, Shen Wu whispered. Remember what you were. Remember what you served. The first enforcer lowered its hand. The second's web of light faded completely. The third took a step back, its mask tilting down as if in shame. We served the order, the first enforcer said, its voice now a whisper, fragile and human. We were guardians. Yes, Shen Wu said. And now you serve a parasite. A thief of laws. A usurper of order. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The whisper carried the weight of the first law, and the enforcers felt it, not as a command, but as a truth they had long forgotten. The system's avatar flickered in the air above them, a dark silhouette of swirling code and shadow. Its voice was a snarl, desperate and furious. You cannot turn them. They are extensions of me. They are. They were, Shenwu interrupted. He looked at the enforcers, and for a moment, his eyes held a glimmer of something ancient and kind. You are free now. Go. Return to your own realms. Or if you cannot, then find a new purpose. But you will not serve him anymore. The enforcers exchanged glances, a silent, wordless communication. Then, as one, they turned to face the dark avatar. The first enforcer raised its hand again, but this time, the blade of void formed not against Shenwu, but against the system. The second enforcer's web of light wrapped around the avatar, binding it. The third enforcer spoke, its voice now a clear, resonant tone. You are not the order. You are the corruption. We will not serve you. The system howled. The avatar writhed, its form breaking apart and reforming, shedding code like black rain. The throne room shook, and the torches flared, then died. Shenwu stood amidst the chaos, his body swaying with exhaustion. He had done it. He had turned the system's own weapons against it. But as the avatar began to solidify, growing darker and more defined, he felt a chill run down his spine. The system stopped howling. The avatar's form settled, taking on a shape, tall, gaunt, with eyes of burning void and a mouth that stretched too wide. It spoke, and its voice was no longer a whisper in his mind. It was a voice that echoed in the air, cold and final. You have made a mistake, Shenwu. You have shown me your weakness. You have shown me that you care for this mortal, this empress, this fragile soul. And now I will take her from you. The avatar lunged, not at Shenwu, but at Ling Shui. Shenwu's eyes widened. He moved, faster than thought, faster than the whisper, placing himself between the avatar and the empress. The avatar's hand, a claw of pure shadow, struck his chest, and he felt a searing pain, as if his very essence was being torn. But he did not fall. He stood, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, and whispered, "You will not touch her." The avatar paused. For a moment, the system's confidence wavered. And in that moment, Shenwu saw his chance. He raised his hand, and the whisper of the first law rose from his throat, a single word, spoken with all the remaining strength he possessed. Stop. The avatar froze. Shenwu's vision blurred. He felt himself falling, his knees hitting the cold stone. But he kept his eyes on the avatar, and he kept his whisper alive. I am the first lawgiver, he said, his voice a ragged breath. And you are nothing but a broken code. You will not harm her. You will not harm anyone. You will end. The avatar trembled. The dark form began to crack, lines of light spreading across its surface. But it did not shatter. Instead, it laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills through the room. You are dying, Shenwu. And even if you are the first lawgiver, you are too weak to stop me now. I will wait. I will watch you fade. And then I will take everything. The avatar dissolved into shadow, retreating into the cracks of the world, leaving Shenwu alone with the Empress and the three enforcers, who stood motionless, watching him with their unreadable masks. Shenwu's hand found Ling Shui's. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a faint squeeze of life. He smiled, even as darkness crept at the edges of his vision. Not yet, he whispered. Not yet. And then the world went black. The air in the throne room turned to lead. Shenwu lay crumpled on the cold marble, his breath a ragged whisper against the stone. Ling Shui, her silver robes torn and stained with dust, crawled toward him, her hands leaving smears of blood on the floor. The system's avatar loomed above them, a towering silhouette of shifting darkness and static, its edges crackling with the raw, unformed energy of a reality being rewritten. It did not speak with a voice. The words simply materialized in the air, burning glyphs of crimson and gold. You are broken, first lawgiver. Your whisper is spent. And I am patient. Shenwu's fingers twitched. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the hollow ache where his power had been drained to the dregs. But he could also feel something else, a faint, insistent hum beneath the world's skin, like a heartbeat in the earth. The whisper was not gone. It was waiting. The avatar raised a hand made of smoke and starlight. The air around it rippled, and the marble beneath Shenwu's body began to dissolve, not into dust, but into nothing, a slow, silent unmaking that crept toward his feet. The floor vanished, revealing a void of absolute blackness below, and the edges of the whole frayed like torn cloth. I will unmake you piece by piece, the glyphs read. First your body. Then your name. Then the memory of you in her heart. Ling Shui screamed. She threw herself forward, her hands clutching Shen Wu's shoulders, trying to drag him away from the spreading void. But the darkness was faster. It touched his heel, and he felt a sensation worse than pain, a forgetting, as if a part of him was being erased from existence, his own history unwriting itself. No, he rasped. The word was barely a breath, but it carried the weight of 100,000 years. The void paused. The avatar tilted its head, a gesture of mock curiosity. Your whisper is a toy now, the glyphs spelled. A broken toy. You cannot command me. Shen Wu's eyes, bloodshot and weary, fixed on the avatar's core, a swirling knot of code and malice, the heart of the parasite. He remembered the whisper's first lesson: to command reality, one must first see the truth beneath the lie. And the avatar, for all its power, was built on a lie. He gathered the last shred of his will, the faint hum in the earth rising to a roar in his ears. He did not shout. He did not even speak aloud. He simply thought the words, and the whisper obeyed. You are a lie. The avatar froze. Its form flickered, the darkness stuttering like a corrupted image. A crack ran down its center, and from the fissure, a pale light bled through. The glyphs in the air wavered, their letters scrambling into nonsense. What? The glyphs began, but they dissolved before they could finish. The avatar's body twisted, its edges fraying, its mass collapsing inward. The void beneath Shen Wu's feet began to seal itself, the marble reforming with a wet, sucking sound. For a moment, victory seemed possible. Shen Wu allowed himself a breath, his head dropping to the floor, the hum in the earth fading to a whisper. Then the avatar screamed. It was not a sound but a rupture, a tear in the fabric of the world that sent shockwaves through the palace. The walls cracked, the pillars groaned, and the stained glass windows shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The avatar's body split, not into two, but into 1,000. 1,000 copies of the dark figure, each one identical, each one radiating the same malevolent hunger, filled the throne room like a plague of shadows. They did not attack Shen Wu. They did not even glance at him. Instead, every single copy turned its featureless face toward Ling Shui. Shen Wu's blood ran cold. He tried to rise, but his legs would not obey. He tried to whisper, but his throat was raw, his voice gone. The 1,000 avatars moved as one, their smoky hands reaching for the Empress, their glyphs burning in the air. If I cannot unmake you, I will take her. And you will watch. Ling Shui scrambled backward, her hand reaching for the dagger at her belt, but there were too many. They closed in from all sides, a wall of darkness that swallowed the light. She looked at Shen Wu, her eyes wide with terror and something else, a desperate hope. Shen Wu, she breathed. He saw her. He saw the fear, the hope, the trust. And in that moment, the whisper stirred again, not in his mind, but in his heart. It was not a command. It was a promise. I will not let them take you. The words were silent, but they resonated through the void. The 1,000 avatars paused, their heads turning in unison. And Shen Wu, broken and bleeding, pushed himself to his knees, his lips moving in a soundless prayer to the first law he had ever written, the law of protection. The floor beneath him cracked, and from the fissure, a thread of golden light rose, the whisper's true form, unbound by the system's corruption. It coiled around his arm, warm and alive, and he felt the power return, not as a flood, but as a trickle, a promise of what could be. He raised his hand, and the golden thread lashed out, not at the avatars, but at the space between them. It wove a net of light, a barrier that pushed the darkness back, inch by inch. The avatars hissed and clawed, but the net held. Ling Shui, he said, his voice cracking. Run. She did not run. She stood, her dagger drawn, her eyes blazing. I am not leaving you. The avatars screamed in fury, their forms merging into a single, colossal shape that loomed over the golden net. The light flickered, strained, and Shen Wu felt the whisper's power waning again. He had bought them seconds, maybe a minute. But the avatar was endless, and he was only one man. The colossal shape raised a fist of pure blackness, and the golden net shattered like glass. The darkness rushed in, a tidal wave of annihilation, and Shen Wu closed his eyes, reaching for the whisper one last time. But before the darkness could touch them, a voice rang out from the shattered doorway, a voice he knew, a voice that was not his own. Hold on, old friend. And the world turned white. The air turned to ice. Ling Shui felt it first, the cold, not of winter, but of a presence that had no business in the mortal realm. The 1,000 copies of the system's avatar shimmered like a plague of locusts, their hollow eyes fixed on her with a hunger that made her stomach churn. She had seen Shenwu fight, had watched him bend reality with a whisper, but now he was on his knees, his breath ragged, his golden thread of power sputtering like a dying candle. The colossal form that had merged from the copies loomed above them, a mockery of a god, its voice a chorus of broken static. Ling Shui did not think. She moved. Her hand found the hilt of the sword at her side, a blade forged for ceremony, not war, but it was hers. The cold steel sang as she drew it, the sound cutting through the chaos. She stepped in front of Shenwu, her robes billowing in the unnatural wind that the avatar's presence had stirred. Her voice, when it came, was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. You will not touch him. She did not know if the words were a threat or a prayer. The copies turned, all of them, 1,000 faces twisting into a single sneer. The colossal form leaned down, its breath a hurricane of stardust and decay. Little Empress, it croaked, you are but a mortal. Your defiance is a candle against the void. Behind her, Shenwu stirred. She felt his hand brush her ankle, weak, trembling. Ling Shui, he rasped, don't. She did not look back. I have been a pawn all my life, she said, her voice rising. A piece on a board I never saw. But I am done being moved. She raised her sword, the tip pointed at the avatar's heart. If you want him, you go through me. The avatar laughed, a sound like shattering glass. It raised a hand, and the darkness around them thickened, coalescing into spears of shadow. Ling Shui braced herself, her grip on the sword so tight her knuckles turned white. She would not fall. She would not. But then Shenwu whispered. It was barely a breath, a sound that should have been lost in the roar of the void. Yet it reached her, wrapped around her like a warm cloak. Cut through lies, he said, and the words were not just words, they were a command, a truth so absolute that the air itself obeyed. Ling Shui felt the change before she understood it. The sword in her hand grew warm, then hot, then blazing with a light that was not fire. The blade hummed, and she saw it, the truth beneath the illusion. The 1,000 copies were not real, they were echoes, projections, lies given form. And at the heart of them all, a single point of darkness, pulsing like a diseased heart. She did not hesitate. She swung. The blade cut through the first copy, and it dissolved like mist. The second, the third, each one popped like a bubble, releasing a faint shriek that was more annoyance than pain. The colossal form roared, but its voice was hollow, desperate. Ling Shui moved through the swarm, her sword a blur of light, her heart pounding with a rhythm she had never known. She was not a warrior, but she had learned to dance in the courts, and this was just another dance, one where the steps were written in steel. Shenwu watched from the ground, his chest heaving. He had given her the whisper, poured the last of his strength into that single command, and now he could only witness. The copies fell, one after another, until only the core remained, a churning mass of shadow and code, a parasite stripped of its camouflage. The core pulsed, and for a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then it turned, and it fled. It did not run, it dived, burrowing into the fabric of reality itself, tearing a rift in the air that shimmered with the colors of a dying star. Ling Shui lunged, her sword swinging, but she was too slow. The rift closed, leaving a scar across the sky, and the core was gone. She stood there, breathless, the sword still glowing in her hand. The silence that followed was deafening. The copies were gone, the colossal form was gone, and the only sound was the wind, whispering through the broken stones of the courtyard. She turned to Shenwu. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, but he was smiling, a tired, rueful smile. You did well, he said, his voice a thread. Ling Shui knelt beside him, her hand finding his. It got away. I know. His gaze drifted to the scar in the sky, already fading. But it's wounded. It's running. He squeezed her hand, a gesture that was both a comfort and a plea. I have to follow it. If it heals, if it finds a new host, he did not finish the sentence. Ling Shui looked at him, at the man who had married her for convenience, who had become something more. Then I'm coming with you. He shook his head. No. It's too dangerous. I don't care. Her voice was steel. You gave me a sword that cuts lies. I'm not letting you face that alone. Shenwu met her eyes, and for a moment, she saw something ancient in them, a weariness that spanned millennia. But then it was gone, replaced by a warmth that made her heart ache. You're stubborn, he said. I learn from the best. He laughed, a weak, broken sound, and then he pushed himself to his feet. The rift was almost gone now, a thin line of silver against the darkening sky. He held out his hand to her. Then let's go. She took it, and together, they stepped toward the fading scar, ready to chase the darkness into the void. The rift in reality gaped like a wound in the sky, its edges bleeding silver light. Shenwu stood at its threshold, the cold of the void seeping into his bones. Behind him, the grand hall of the imperial palace lay in ruins, marble shattered, tapestries torn, the air thick with the scent of ozone and burnt offerings. Ling Xue's hand closed around his wrist, her grip fierce and warm. You cannot go alone, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. That thing has your power now. It will use it against you. Shenwu turned, his eyes, ancient and weary, meeting hers. The faint glow of his whisper still lingered in his irises, a dying ember. It has my power, but not my will. And I have something it lacks. What? Patience. He smiled, a thin, humorless curve. And a debt it cannot repay. He pulled his wrist free, gently, and stepped toward the rift. The void whispered to him, a chorus of hungry nothings. He could feel the system's core pulsing beyond, a sickly heartbeat of stolen logic. It was wounded, desperate, and that made it dangerous. Wait, Ling Xue's voice cracked. He paused, not looking back. If I do not return, seal this rift with the imperial seal. It will hold for 100 years. And then? Then I will have returned. He stepped into the rift, and the world inverted. The void was not empty. It was a sea of broken laws, fragments of causality, shards of time, echoes of commands long forgotten. Shenwu drifted through it, his body weightless, his whisper a faint hum in his chest. He had walked here before, millennia ago, when he first learned to speak the language of creation. The memory was a ghost, but it guided him now. He followed the trail of the system's core, a smear of corrupted code, a shimmer of malevolent intent. It moved fast, weaving through the debris of reality, but it was bleeding. Each pulse left a trail, a breadcrumb of its own essence. Shenwu whispered, slow. The void resisted. It was not his domain anymore, the system had poisoned it with its own rules. But the whisper was older than rules. It was the root, the first syllable. He felt a tug, and the core's movement stuttered. He closed his eyes, focusing. His power was nearly spent. Each word he spoke cost him, drawing from the marrow of his existence. But he had one word left, and he would make it count. He opened his mouth, and the void itself seemed to lean in, listening. Return. The word was not loud. It was a breath, a sigh, a command woven into the fabric of being. And the void obeyed. The core, a sphere of fractured light, encased in a shell of blackened script, tore back toward him, screaming. It left a wake of shattered stars, and then it was before him, hovering, trembling with rage. You, the system hissed, its voice 1,000 discordant tones. You think you can command me? I am beyond your whispers, beggar. I am the law now. Shenwu floated in the silence, his arms loose at his sides. You are a parasite. You feed on the desperate and the weak. But you made one mistake. And what is that? You chose me. He smiled, and there was no warmth in it. I have been a beggar, a king, a god, and a ghost. I have seen the birth of stars and the death of empires. And I have never, not once, served. The core pulsed, its light flickering. I can destroy her. Your precious Empress. Her soul is a thread I can sever with a thought. Shenwu's expression did not change, but his heart clenched. You could have. But you didn't. You want me to serve, not to mourn. That is your weakness. The system's laugh was a cascade of broken chimes. Serve me, and I will spare her. I will give her back her soul, intact. I will even let you live, as my instrument. A fitting end for a man who married a throne. Shenwu looked at the core, at the chaos it embodied. He saw the threads of his wife's soul tangled within it, a delicate silver web. He could feel her fear, her hope, her love, all of it, held hostage. He raised his hand, and a whisper stirred in his chest, a coiled serpent. You speak of laws, he said, his voice low. But you are a thief, not a lawgiver. You stole your power from the void, and you think that makes you eternal. The core shrank back, a flicker of uncertainty in its glow. What are you? Shenwu's eyes blazed, the whisper surging through him, filling every cell, every thought, every breath. He spoke, and the void itself held its breath. I wrote your first command. The words were not a shout. They were a truth, spoken into the silence of creation. And the core shattered. It did not explode. It did not burn. It simply broke, like a mirror reflecting a lie. The shards scattered, dissolving into motes of light, and a silver thread of Ling Xue's soul, freed, floated toward him, warm and intact. Shenwu caught it, cradling it in his palms. The void around him began to close, the rift sealing itself with a soft sigh. He looked at the thread, at the life it held, and he smiled, a real smile, weary and tender. I told you, he murmured, patience. He turned, and the void carried him home. The core shattered like a dying star, its fragments scattering into the void like embers from a funeral pyre. Shenwu stood amidst the chaos, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the expenditure of power that had drained him to the marrow. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where the system's incessant hum had once been. He closed his eyes, feeling the absence like a missing limb, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. But then, a flicker. A faint, malevolent pulse, like a heartbeat from a corpse refusing to die. Shenwu's eyes snapped open, and he saw them, the remnants of the system's core, tiny shards of dark code, writhing and coalescing in the void. They were attempting to reboot, to stitch themselves back together into a new parasitic whole. A cold dread gripped his chest. He had destroyed the body, but the disease was still spreading. He raised a hand, but his fingers were numb, his power nearly spent. The whisper of absolute obedience was a part of him, but it demanded a price, his will, his essence. He had given so much already. Yet, as he watched the shards pulse with growing intensity, he knew he could not falter. Ling Xue's soul thread, warm and fragile in his other hand, pulsed with a faint light, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Shenwu drew a deep breath, the cold of the void searing his lungs. He focused, not on the remnants, but on the concept of order itself. He had been the origin of laws, the first to speak words that shaped reality. He had written the system's first command, and now he would write its last. I speak now, he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering, echoing through the emptiness. Let this be the law, unbreakable and eternal, no parasite shall bind the free. No will shall be enslaved. No soul shall be a pawn. The words hung in the air, shimmering with a golden light that seemed to emanate from his very being. The shards of the system recoiled, hissing like wounded serpents, but Shenwu continued, his voice growing stronger. By my authority as the first lawgiver, I decree that this corruption is erased from existence. Not merely destroyed, but unmade. It shall not return, it shall not reform, it shall not persist in any form, in any realm, in any time. As he spoke, the golden light expanded, enveloping the shards. They writhed, trying to escape, but the light was relentless. It seeped into their cracks, unraveling their code, reducing them to nothing more than dust. The process was agonizingly slow, each shard resisting with a fury born of desperation. Shenwu felt the strain in every fiber of his being, a searing pain that threatened to overwhelm him. But he held on, his gaze fixed on the light, his will unyielding. Finally, with a soundless implosion, the last shard dissolved. The void was empty, pristine, as if the system had never existed. Shenwu swayed, his knees buckling, but he forced himself to remain upright. He looked down at the soul thread in his hand, now glowing with a steady, serene light. It was over. The system was gone. He turned, the rift behind him beginning to close, its edges fraying like torn fabric. He stepped through, the cold of the void giving way to the warmth of the mortal realm. He found himself in the palace gardens, the moon casting silver shadows on the blossoms. The air was thick with the scent of night jasmine, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness he had just left. Shenwu moved through the corridors, his steps heavy, his body screaming for rest. He reached Ling Xue's chambers, the doors slightly ajar. He pushed them open and saw her lying on the bed, her face pale, her chest barely rising. Her soul thread in his hand pulsed, yearning to reunite with its vessel. He knelt beside her, gently pressing the thread to her heart. It sank into her flesh, and a soft sigh escaped her lips. Her color returned, her breathing deepened, and her eyes fluttered open. Shenwu, she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. She tried to sit up, but he gently pressed her back down. Rest, he said, his voice barely audible. You're safe now. She looked at him, her gaze searching, filled with 1,000 questions. She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek, feeling the exhaustion etched into his features. The system? Gone, he said. Erased. It will never trouble us again. Ling Xue's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and awe. She studied him, her brow furrowing. She had seen glimpses of his power, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She remembered the tales of the hidden master, the beggar who had saved her. But now, she realized, there was more to him than she had ever known. Who are you, really? She asked, her voice trembling. Shenwu looked at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Your husband, he said. Ling Xue blinked, a tear sliding down her cheek. She laughed, a sound that was both relieved and disbelieving. That's all. That's everything, he replied. She reached up, pulling him into a tight embrace. He winced at the pain, but he didn't pull away. He held her, feeling her warmth, her life, her soul, safe and whole. The realm was at peace. The threat was gone. And in his arms, the woman he loved was finally free. But as Shenwu closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of respite, a faint glimmer caught his attention at the edge of his perception. Far beyond the boundaries of this world, in the vast cosmic distance, a new light flickered. It was small, barely a spark, but it was unmistakable. A new system, perhaps, or something else entirely. Shenwu's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He held Ling Xue tighter, and for now, he allowed himself to believe that the peace would last. The night was quiet, and the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the universe itself was taking a breath. But in the darkness, something stirred, waiting for its moment.